hilarious.
That's right.
My name is John Allen. My agency is Community Insurance Advisors. We're an independent agency, which means we write with a lot of different companies. And really my passion has to do with cyber insurance because there are not a lot of other people talking about it. So today I want to talk a little bit about where cyber insurance can fit into the risk mitigation strategy. It's part of a process, not a product by itself necessarily. And I promise you, this is not an insurance pitch. This is more of a strategic discussion, right? So let me screen share here real quick. Try this. Can everybody see this? Good. All right. So what are we going to talk about today? I want to talk a little bit about cyber insurance in the press. How is it represented? I want to talk about whether or not cyber insurance is expensive. There are a lot of misnomers about how expensive cyber insurance is. I want to talk about that. How do I know how much coverage and what kind of coverage I should have? Are all policies created equal? No, they're not. How do I know what my insurance really covers and what it really doesn't? And then we'll talk about some takeaways. All right. So some initial thoughts about cyber insurance. And by the way, at the end of this, I've left plenty of time for Q&As. So what you may want to do is, if you have questions, either put them in chat or at the end we'll have all sorts of time to just interact. Okay. Initial thoughts about cyber risk. Well, the first one is that up until about 5 or 6 years ago, you couldn't even get cyber insurance. Now you can. So that's a major plus. How big is the cyber threat? You know, since I'm talking to people that are outside the US, I usually put this in a US context. I've read several articles that say that the threat is expected to be somewhere around $6 trillion, $6 trillion with a T in the year 2021. What I'll typically do is I'll say, well, if you assume that the US economy is roughly 10% of that, that's $600 billion of threat. And to compare that to the largest natural disaster in the last 150 years, everybody remember that big tsunami that hit Japan in 2011? The economic impact of that was $253 billion. So what we're talking about in 2021 in the US alone is roughly double the biggest natural disaster impact in the last 150 years. That's gargantuan. Is insurance ready for that? Not even close. If insurance were to really truly be able to cover that entire exposure, that $600 billion in the US, there would have to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $1 trillion worth of insurance written. And I can guarantee you there's nothing approaching that's out there. So it just says that the marketplace is still getting used to the idea of the fact that this cyber threat is really a big threat. Now, speaking of being prepared, you know, this COVID thing, I think, hit all of us by surprise. Maybe there were a few scientists that knew it was coming, but most of us, by and large, were completely, utterly, you know, blindsided by this thing. And forgetting the medical and the death impact of this, the economic impact of COVID has been huge. What is it, 40 million people unemployed in the US? That's gargantuan. The issue with cyber is we know it's coming. So we have the opportunity to working together, do something about that. So I want to talk about things that we should be doing to get ready for that. How do you protect yourself? Well, most of you on this call probably understand most of this already, so I kind of feel like I'm preaching to the choir. The first thing that I tell people is do an assessment. Understand, you know, where are the landmines, right? Second is make sure you have an ongoing and robust security protocol in place. Third is make sure that you have an incident response plan. And then fourth, and this is after the fact, make sure you talk about, you know, where does insurance fit in? It may not fit everything. And one of the misnomers I want to dispel early on is that insurance covers everything. It does not cover everything. Insurance is very specific about what it covers and what it doesn't. So understanding where insurance can fit into this is really, in my opinion, key to your strategy. Right? So let's talk about cyber insurance in the press. There was an article that came out about a year ago about a company named Norsk Hydro. They had a big cyber attack in March of 2019. And there was a press release. The press release talked about the financial disclosures. The financial disclosure said that the impact was estimated to be somewhere between $60 and $70 million, and the insurance paid $3.5 million. Now, we're all very, very busy, right? How many of us read past that headline? Very few of us. But when you go to read the article itself says that that $3.5 million payment was simply one of several payments, and that they expected to be fully compensated, right? So on some level, you have to be careful of what information you're taking in, because it doesn't, you know, the headlines don't always tell the whole story, right? So the other thing about this is we don't know. You look at that $60 million number and you say, well, what is it that made that impact so high? Was it fines and penalties? Was it lawsuits? Was it mitigation activities? Maybe it was lost sales and lost reputation, right? All of these things can factor in to the impact of a cyber strike. So we don't know, and we don't really know how much insurance North purchased. So let's talk about, is insurance expensive? I'm going to give you a case study. This is a company that we worked with here in the Dallas area. The tech company that we dealt with had about $50 million in annual sales, right? And here's what their insurance profile looked like. Their overall insurance cost for all lines, for workers' comp, for general liability, for cyber, all of it was $32,000 bucks. The technology piece is the pricey piece. So they got, their concern was E&O coverage for technology E&O. So they got $1 million policy, and that policy cost them $21,000 bucks. They said, well, we're a $50 million company. $1 million bucks isn't going to cut it. We need more coverage than that. So they added another $10 million by getting an umbrella. Well, when you look at the entire insurance spend, $32,000 bucks, yes, that's a big number. But in the context of a $50 million gross revenue operation, that's only 0.06%. And let's put that in our household context. If we live in a household where we make $100,000, imagine having an auto policy for $60 a year. That's the same relationship that $32,000 represents in a $50 million enterprise. Is it expensive? Well, $32,000 is a lot of money you'd rather keep in your P&L, but relative to the overall operation, it's not. It's just not a big expense. So it really depends. And then the next question is, well, for a $50 million company, is $11 million enough? How do I know how much coverage I should have? They felt that 11 million was fine, and so they're happy with that. So how do we know how much coverage we should have, right? And I would imagine most of you on this call also have seen these data breach calculators. This one is from eRisk Hub. It's very, very simple. Anybody can do it. I can do it. I'm a non-techie, and I can do it easily. How many records are exposed? Swag it if you don't know. 2,500 maybe, let's say. What kind of data was it? Was it PCI? Was it PII? Was it PHI? Is it the organization's first breach? Was the data stored in a centralized system or location? Do you expect that fraud was involved? Is there a class action lawsuit expected? Chances are pretty good if everybody got hit, there's going to be a class action lawsuit. And then does your organization currently have data breach coverage? You simply answer the questions. It'll take most people, 30 seconds to do this? And when you're done, it spits out something like this. Now, I did 3 different iterations, and I'm running through 3 different scenarios, kind of all in one chart. So bear with me a second here. So the first one, excuse me, assumes that the organization that's hit has 18,000 records. I deal with a lot of small motels, and that's about 50 transactions a day. So anybody in a rural area under normal times, not during COVID maybe, but during normal times, 50 transactions a day isn't a big deal. Well, you look at the impact of that size organization getting hit, your incident investigations and customer notifications, what, 230,000 bucks in round numbers? You've got fines and penalties and PCI fines, about 80,000 bucks, and the class action lawsuit approaching $600,000. So just for a small little motel of 50 transactions a day, their exposure could be around 900,000 bucks. Now, we're not arguing whether these dollars are exactly absolute. It's just kind of giving you a sense for how big this exposure could be, right? So let's take the next one, 1,000 records of PII. I probably have 1,000 contacts on my phone, as a lot of you probably do, right? But if my data got compromised, and let's say that I had dates of birth and social security numbers and such, what would that look like for me? Well, incident investigations, customer notification, 210,000 bucks. Class action lawsuits still huge, right? Fines and penalties aren't that huge because we've only got 1,000 records. But what if I take that now to 100,000 records just for fun? And heaven forbid, what if your cap one, it's 120 million records? Can you imagine the impact of that, right? So incident investigations on 100,000, that and customer notification is about $750,000 bucks. Now your fines and penalties are up to 200,000 bucks because you've got more, you've got more scale here. And you still got a class action lawsuit. So really, the point of this exercise is to kind of get just a sense for what does this landscape look like. And I would argue the benefit of this is probably more for the boardroom than it is for the IT community. IT community understands just inherently what's going on, but the boardroom may not be able to put a number on this. And once we can collectively define what that number looks like, at least theoretically, now we can start an intelligent discussion about what do we do about it, right? So this to me is always the most challenging slide here. And this, I'm gonna try and get through this here in a clear-cut manner. So I think the challenge I've struggled with, why is it so hard to get people to understand insurance, other than the fact that it's just excruciatingly boring for most people, but how is it that it's so difficult by itself to understand it? Well, the reason is I think we're speaking different languages, right? Let's put aside for a second that the IT world has its own language that most of the rest of us don't understand. We simply don't. We don't deal in that world, and so it's different. But the boardroom talks like this. Boardroom talks about cost of incident investigations, talks of cost of class action lawsuits and such. And these categories here generally mirror what the data breach calculators are telling you. So they understand this. But you can't go to an insurance company and ask for incident investigation insurance. This is what insurance companies talk about. They talk about things like privacy regulations and proceeding supplements. It's a whole different language. And ultimately, these things here ultimately get to the data breach expense categories, but not without somebody that can help you interpret. And heaven forbid that you try and understand this all on your own. You know, most people don't have the time, they don't have the desire, they don't, I'm busy, just, you know, tell me what I want. So what's the default? The default is I'm going to get a GL that, you know, costs less than everything else, because after all, aren't all policies created equal? No, they're not. Every one of these coverages is opt-in coverage. You don't automatically get coverage for these things unless you specifically buy it, okay? So the way that insurance companies categorize their exposures is really on 3 levels fundamentally. And each company uses slightly different language, but basically speaking, these are the 3 categories. The first one is information risk. What does information risk mean to an insurance company? Information risk generally covers you for data breach activities, which is access to private information. So it could be network security violations, somebody hacks into the network. It could be that the network is interrupted for some reason. That's an info risk category. It could be that you've got privacy injury liability. So we're talking about privacy injury and proceedings. That's an information risk category, okay? The next major category is media liability. What does media liability cover? Media liability talks about things like defamation and disparagement or invasion of privacy. Maybe you get somebody that's an employee that gets on a social media website and says something disparaging and semi-well-intended towards one of your competitors. Now the competitor takes offense. That's media liability. Third is technology errors and omissions. And I think a lot of you on this call, especially if you're working in a consulting role, if you're giving advice to somebody that somebody follows, then E&O could kick in if they follow that advice and something goes south. Okay, so that's a category. So it doesn't mean that you need all of these things, but think of this as a menu of things that you should consider having, so that depending on the nature of your operations and the kind of people that you're dealing with and where that data is housed. You know, if I'm just selling, for example, but all the data is housed somewhere else, am I worried necessarily about information risk? Maybe less so, but I certainly want to at least have the conversation, right? So how do you, there's a lot here. So how do you think about this in terms of an organized approach to dealing with insurance? And I go back to this data breach, these categories over here. So I look at these first 2 categories: incident investigations, customer notifications, and crisis management. These are the things that happen when, you know, all hell's breaking loose, right? The pipe's leaking, there's water everywhere. You're focusing on getting the water to stop and cleaning up the mess, okay? So the question is, can I get insurance that will pay for these activities? Because when that happens, am I going to have to spend all my time as a manager cleaning up the mess and not running my business? Or do I want to send that task out to somebody else? Man, I'm making up numbers here. These have no correlation necessarily to reality, but let's just say that the exposure for here is $500,000. And let's just say that I can get insurance to cover that for $10,000 a year. On the years that I don't have a claim, that $10,000 is wasted money. But on the years I do have a claim, I spent $10,000 to get a $500,000 benefit. We have to weigh those trade-offs. It may or may not be a good deal. You just have to decide whether or not that makes sense. Similarly, down here in the fines and penalties, you have the same issue. These are things that happen after the fact, right? So now that the dust is settled, now you're back to running operations. Now you got a lot of very angry people whose data was compromised. They're going to come after you probably in terms of fines and penalties. Do you want to take that and let the insurance company worry about that, or do you want to, you know, risk diving into your own bank account, paying for that yourself? That's the conversation. Yeah. So I'm going to do a couple quick case studies. First one is a small construction company. I deal with a lot of GCs, small GCs. And they're all like, oh, we're a small construction company, we won't get hit. Well, they do get hit. Hacker steals contractor files, client and employee PIIs exposed. What's the response? Well, the construction company had to provide written notification to all the affected individuals, and they had to provide 1 year of credit monitoring. So what was the exposure? The company was out 1.5 million bucks. Defense costs were 500 of that. Privacy expenses were 100,000 of that. Privacy expenses cover things like notifying individuals, doing the credit monitoring and such, and then the customer damages of 900,000 bucks, and that's to recover stolen data and replace stolen data. Here's the issue. The paradox in this case in particular was that, so after that credit monitoring ended, about 6 months after that year went by, the stolen data was sold, and the people that bought the stolen data turned around and opened bogus accounts in the names of the people whose data was stolen. So that's the gift that keeps on giving, right? So you as a company want to make sure that you've got some amount of protection for something like that, okay? Next case is a technology company, a mid-sized tech company. The company that was hit, they operated a website that their clients relied on to be able to do their business. That website was disrupted by a virus, right? So what happened? The client's ability to generate, their client's ability to generate income was interrupted because the website wasn't working, so they were basically locked out. So the client sued the tech company. The exposure, 600,000 bucks. Defense costs of 100 and customer damages of 500. And you would think, based on that calculator, that was probably a fairly small company. Or the breach wasn't that great. If it's a mid-sized company, it was only 600,000 bucks. That's really not, it's a lot of money, but it's could have been a lot worse. All right, let me talk about some takeaways here real quick. Well, let me catch up to myself. Sorry, I got my notes here. All right, so the first takeaway is make sure you know your exposure. You all know where the kinks in the armor are within your own organizations, most of them anyway, right? If you're going to have a cyber issue, where is it likely to be? If something about cyber at work keeps you up at night, what is it? And those are the things you should focus on. If you're not really sure, you can always get an insurance questionnaire and fill it out. It doesn't mean you have to actually apply for the insurance, but insurance companies will ask you questions that they're concerned about, and think about it. They're asking you those questions because they pay claims for the things that they're asking questions about. So if they pay claims, that's a pretty good clue that you might want to be concerned about that also, and just to make sure you have your flank covered, right? Same thing, insurance companies will send out risk control. They'll come out and they'll kick the tires in advance. So if you're not sure and you want them to look at, they'll come and talk to you. It doesn't hurt to have them take a look. Second thing is understand what types of coverage are available. We talked about the information risk. We talked about media liability. We talked about tech E&O. Part of that is make sure you understand what's covered, but also make sure you understand what's excluded. There is a whole section in every insurance policy that's ever written that talks about what they don't cover. And then also talk about events that would trigger them declining a claim that they said they would cover. So who can think of some of those, right? One of them is there's a reporting requirement typically. If you don't report a claim within a certain amount of time, a lot of times the insurance company will decline. And that may sound on the surface of it like maybe that's kind of a bogus excuse. But when you think about it, think about your own roof. In Texas, we have a lot of hail and wind. And so about every 10 years or so, we get a new roof. Well, if I repair my roof and replace it, and I don't call the insurance company for 6 months, they're going to say, yeah, we would have paid it had you told us when it happened. But here it is 6 months later, you got a roof that's, how do I know you really had a roof issue? And similarly in cyber, you've got to be on time. Time is of the essence with cyber. Another one is, let's say that you assert that you have all these security behavioral protocols in place. You know, you don't share passwords, you don't do these other things. But then you have a claim because you weren't doing any of the things you said. It's possible that you're not going to get paid. So you have to be consistent. If you're going to say you're going to do these things, you have to at least have policies in place. And organizationally, it can't just be an IT issue. It has to be a behavioral HR/organizational issue that says, we're not going to send emails with passwords on it. We're not going to post emails with passwords on the wall. We're not going to let our friends' kids use our laptops, our work laptops. All these things that should be self-evident, we need to make sure that the culture drives those behaviors. Third, if you run a really tight ship, you're going to get much better premiums and much better deductibles. Imagine if you go to shop for auto insurance and you tell your agent, you know, the only time I drive is when I drive at least 20 miles an hour over the speed limit and I've had at least 6 beers. What do you think your premium is going to look like if you even get it? You won't. Well, equally irresponsibly in the IT world, we actually got invited to bid on a case last year. A school district actually well into the hundreds of millions of dollars in scope. That school district had no CISO, They had no encryption on their laptops, and they're asking for $1 million of coverage on a roughly $500 million enterprise. Does it feel to anybody here like that school district had any idea what they're doing? None. And why would the insurance company want to give them a blank check? They don't. So you do have to at least have some controls in place to make sure that you can get coverage. And then finally, you know, when you go through this exercise as an enterprise and you talk about all the things that could happen, you don't have to solve all those things right away. Map it out. Most organizations, you know, mid-size and up, go through some version of an annual SWOT process. What do we do well? Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. What do we do well? Where are we a little bit exposed? What are we good at? What are we not so good at? And what do we need to improve? Well, make cyber part of that conversation. And cyber isn't just about IT, it's about marketing. It's about the company image, it's about HR, it's about all of it. And how can we integrate that cyber talk into the organizational conversation, really? So, you know, at least that way, if you're planning for growth, maybe you identify 7 things you need to do. Maybe you deal with 1 this year, and next year when you hit a certain volume 2, you get to the next one, you get onto those next things, but you gradually grow into it. With that, I'm going to open it up to questions. Yeah.